I think we're going to get started. I want to give a brief introduction, and then we will let each of our panelists show a few slides and share their perspectives, and then we'll do a fireside chat followed by Q&A. And all of this will start and end promptly in the 1 hour time frame. So first of all, my name is Peter Leung. I am head of the investment bank Leung & Partners, but I'm here really as the lead organizer of the Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings Initiative, of which this event is part of that initiative. Many of you know about the Committee 100, but just briefly, for those of you who don't, it's an organization that was founded over 30 years ago by some very well-known people such as I.M. Pei, Yo-Yo Ma, and so forth. And its purpose is really as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization made up of a leadership of Chinese Americans in a wide variety of professions, really to do two things. One is to promote the full participation of all Chinese Americans in the American society, and it's a public policy resource for the Chinese American community, whether it's about issues such as discrimination or otherwise. The other is to provide a vehicle for advancing constructive dialogue between the peoples and leaders of the United States and China. And they have a proud tradition of doing this over 30 plus years. Two of us on this who are on this webcast are Committee 100 members, Buck I.M. and Buck G as well. So this particular webinar is the first in a series of events that the Committee 100 is hosting that will examine the challenges facing Chinese Americans and more broadly Asian Americans with regard to barriers to advancement in a wide variety of professions. It's interesting, people use terms like, bamboo ceiling or glass ceiling, but we want to think about this in a more expansive way, that it's not just professions, it's not just promotion, it's really just essentially a success and advancement. Let me see if I think the person is right. So about the music, but basically it's really meant to be focused on barriers to advancement and recognition. And it's not just promotions. It could be whether you're considered for an Oscar or otherwise. And that's really obviously not a situation where you're getting promoted. We realize there are many organizations that have been focused on this issue, but in different ways, whether it's helping to train or organize people politically. But we hope that we can contribute to the already significant efforts that a lot of organizations and individuals have been focused on in tackling this issue. This first event is a fireside chat where each of our panelists are going to spend a few minutes with some slides showing some data and perspectives that they have on the issue of how bad is the problem. And then we'll have fireside chat and we'll have Q&A. I think I see the problem of the career ceiling really divided into three things that we want to accomplish. One is to try to help people understand how bad the problem is, because quite frankly, I'm not sure many people realize that this is a big problem, right? Second is, not on this call, but in the other events that we're going to have, we're going to focus on what are things that are being done today to try to tackle the problem. And then we are going to have some programs to try to look at things that could be done that are currently not being done or could be done better than they're being done now, with the overall objective of educating people about the problem more broadly, identifying what things are being done to solve it, but then really create some real action items and initiatives to help solve the problem. So with that, what I'd like to do is just first introduce our two panelists. I'm very pleased to have two people who really know this area quite well. Buck G is, in addition to being a member of the Committee 100, he had a long and very successful career in Silicon Valley, where he was a very senior executive at companies including Cisco. But just as important, he has dedicated himself to help collect and identify data that really illuminates this problem. So he's on this panel for two very good reasons. Harrison Leung is a partner of McKinsey, and aside from the work that he's been doing for clients in the technology area, et cetera, but he also happens to be involved with the Asians at McKinsey group, which is a diversified, inclusive group aimed at fostering and advancing Asian Americans in the workplace. He too has a wealth of data to focus on this issue, but also he has perspectives due to the work that his group does within McKinsey. And I think many of you may have seen some of the articles that, that have appeared, that have been pushed forward by that group. So with that, what I'd like to do, and obviously their full biographies are in the invitation that all of you read. So with that, what I'd like to do is start first with Buck, who has some slides that, hold on.
Do we do slide now, or do you do a quick intro about myself?
Why don't you do that? Start with the intro, and then when you're ready for the slides, let me know.
Okay. All right. So Peter mentioned my bio briefly. I spent 35 years in Silicon Valley. Started off as an engineer, and ultimately wound up as a general manager at Cisco Systems, vice president, general manager, Cisco Systems. I got involved in the issue. I was acquired by Cisco, and after a couple of years after acquired, I realized that I was the only Chinese vice president in development, and that was a problem. I thought these deserved resolving. So I did some things at Cisco, then retired almost actually 10 years ago. I've been working on this issue ever since. So let's, if you want to throw up slides, Peter, let me go to that. Almost there. Okay. So we as a community have a diversity problem, and it's one, as Peter alluded to, that's really hidden in plain sight. So let me explain. I'll be going over a few slides, and for those who are just phoning in and can't see the screen, I'll try to describe what's going on. To begin, I wanted to provide an overall picture of Asian Americans, and I just look at it in New York at this point, the New York metro area, and that includes New York City, New Rochelle, Mount Vernon, and parts of New Jersey, Newark and New Jersey, and Jersey City. And I'm going through publicly available EEOC data that show that, to start off, in 2018, Asian Americans are 12% of the total workforce in the New York area, but hold 21% of the white-collar professional jobs. You can find most Asian professionals in 4 industries. And Peter, if you just move to the next, thank you. 4 industries: healthcare, finance, and insurance, professional services, information. 59% of the Asian workforce, professional workforce in New York, work here. And most Asians overall work in professional jobs. 66% of all Asians in New York area are in non-managerial white-collar jobs. It's much higher than non-Asian, which is about 40%. Today, I'm highlighting 2 industries where over a third of Asians work: professional services in New York, Deloitte and McKinsey, and finance insurance, HSBC and MetLife. In both these industries, you'll find a very high concentration of white-collar jobs. Over 75% are white-collar jobs here. And 86% of the Asian employees in these companies are in professional or managerial jobs. Okay, next slide, Peter. Thank you. So I'm showing 2 charts breaking out the Asian workforce by levels in the manager pipeline for 5 years, 2014 to 2018. The chart on the left, for those who can see it, is for finance insurance. The chart on the right is professional services. To interpret these charts, the top orange line and on both of them show the percentage of Asians in the professional non-managerial jobs during this period. In finance insurance, for those who can't see, it grows from 22 to 25%. The blue line shows Asians in middle management growing to 22%, and the red line shows Asians in executive jobs, and that's the highest three levels, growing to 11%. Those who can see the charts will notice a one-year spike in 2016 in executives in professional service, and that appears to be an error. As best as I can tell, the actual numbers for the years before and after are similar, and the spike in 2016 is an anomaly. Anyway, one way of looking at data here is to look at the charts and ask the question, compared to the fact that Asians are 9% of the region's population, are we fairly represented in the workforce? To answer that question, you can look at data and say the answer is yes. Compared to 9%, whether it's individual contributors, middle manager, or even executive levels, all are higher than 9%. And even better, the numbers are increasing. Peter, do you want me to answer these questions as I see it come up on my screen, by the way?
No,
okay,
the questions are for the end of the session.
Got it. Okay. Anyway, so yes, we are fairly represented. Unfortunately, that's the only question, the only comparison that is asked about racial diversity. Hence, the general conclusion is that there are no Asian diversity problems. But today we're addressing another question. Is there a career ceiling for Asians in the workforce? We're well represented, but is there a career ceiling? And the question I ask is, if Asians are 25% of the workforce, why are we only 11% of the executives?
Now, Buck, one point to mention is that the statistics may look different if you go to different professions. It happens to be in finance and professional services.
That's right.
Asians do better. So the reality is it's not true that as you go across different regions or different professions that Asian Americans do better than their percentage in the population, right?
So that's true. If you look at natural data, the natural data says we're 6% of the population, we're 12% of the professionals. So even if I look at the natural data, it's overall true, Peter. I think it may vary from one region to another, but by and large, you're doing pretty well. It's certainly in the large urban areas that I've looked at, which is LA, Chicago, San Francisco, New York, for example, okay, Washington. So the question is, why aren't we getting promoted? Why does the data show there's a career ceiling for so many? If we're 25% in this case, and I'm looking at finance, insurance, and professional services in New York, why are we 25% of the worker bees and only 11% of the leaders? But by the way, I want to make it clear that I'm not claiming that this gap between Asians at the top and the bottom of the pyramid is fair or not. It's a question. Perhaps it is fair, perhaps it's proper. Also, I'm not per se claiming there's overt racial discrimination. In fact, I don't believe that is the problem. But the Asian question is not asked in most companies, and that is a problem. And to be clear, when I look at these numbers with my background as an executive, as a corporate executive, the issue has nothing to do with diversity per se. It has to do with my responsibility to identify, motivate, and develop the most talented in my group. And because I don't believe that talent is disproportionately distributed to the white workforce, these numbers raise the question, what am I doing wrong as an executive not to do that? I frame this question clearly by comparing the numbers at the executive level to the numbers as individual contributors in a simple computed ratio. I define the Executive Parity Index, or EPI, as a ratio of the top and the bottom. When the numbers at the top and the bottom of the pyramid are the same, the index should be 1. So for example, if it's 10% of the top and 10% of the bottom, it should be 1. Over an index greater than 1 means overrepresented or above parity. Under 1 means underrepresented or under parity. Okay. With that simple example, let me show the data says this. For professional services, then, the Executive Parity Index is computed to be 0.58. So I can say Asian executive representation is 42% below parity or below representation. This allows me to ask a very specific questions. Are Asians being fairly promoted in the workplace? if our representation at leadership levels are 42% our workplace? That's a question we need our companies to focus on. Unlike Blacks or Hispanics or women, they don't have to worry about hiring enough Asian Americans. As the data says, we're well represented. We want to ask our companies whether they are adequately developing, identifying, promoting us. These charts show that the companies are succeeding in the first, hiring, but failing in the second. The executive parity index also means that we can compare different industries. So I put these two charts together because it's a normalized ratio, independent size of the workforce. So when I compare the indices between professional services and finance insurance, I can say the odds of achieving executive levels appears to be better if you work in professional services with an EPI of 0.58 versus finance insurance, which is 0.46. It also allows me to compare across racial cohorts. I put up some charts, and these charts indicate the EPI, the blue line for the white workforce, gray for Hispanic, orange for Asian, and red for Black. And for those who can't see the charts, white EPI in finance and insurance in the year 2018 is 1.42, or whites are 42% above parity. Hispanic is 0.5, Asia's 0.46, and Black is 0.36. I want to make 3 points at this point, 3 points with these charts. One, the normalized executive representation for whites as computed by EPI is 1.42 or significantly above parity. That should not be surprising to anybody. But the indices for most minorities are well below parity and all very similar. That should be a surprise to most. And certainly when I present this data to diversity organizations, they're shocked to see this. They've never thought about this. The third thing I want to point out, besides being similar, is that there has been no significant improvement over time reaching executive levels for Hispanics, Blacks, or even Asians. Even though our numbers are increasing, our relative proportion is the same, roughly the same. In summary, comparing the EPI of whites versus Asians, in finance insurance, you'll find that the normalized representation of whites is 3.1 times higher than Asian. In professional services, this ratio, the difference is between white and Asians is 2.3 times. Now, I've only talked about two industries in one metro area, but there are similar gaps in almost all industries I've looked at in almost all regions. So I want to conclude by saying the data is clear and consistent. People see that there are lots of Asian Americans throughout the pipeline. That's what they see. But what they don't see, and what the data makes clear, hidden in plain sight, is that the odds for Asian Americans to become executive leaders are well below those of their white counterparts. And in fact, their odds are similar to the Black and Hispanic peers. That's our problem, and that's our career ceiling.
Well, and I also think, Buck, that you've mentioned to me some data that basically says actually getting into some of these professions is not necessarily the biggest problem, although it can be a problem. It's getting past the middle ranks, right?
That's right. That's right.
And that's the real problem. And the question is, why is that true? But it's a serious issue, and it's a serious issue across many professions. And although in some professions it's far worse than others, right? So that's a big issue. Well, that's very helpful. And now what I'm going to do is I'm now going to turn it over to to Harrison, who has a couple of slides as well. And maybe Harrison, you want to start out like Buck did and just talk a little bit about before you go to the slides, just talk a little bit about the issue in general.
Sure. Thanks, Peter. And if you can maybe hit Control L on the screen so we can maximize it, that would be good. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harrison Leung. I am a partner for McKinsey based out of our New Jersey office and part of our technology as well as our digital practices. As Peter mentioned, aside from the client work that I do, I'm also one of our leaders within a diversity and inclusion affinity group called Asians at McKinsey, which aims to foster and create the affinity between Asian Americans within our firm as well as look at and build external collaborations such as this. Similar to Buck, I also started as an engineer earlier in my career before transitioning to management consulting. And actually recently spent quite a long stint of my career in Asia as well. And sort of my interest in this topic stems from the fact when I was a partner for McKinsey in Hong Kong and I looked around, everyone was Asian, right? And this is pretty much the demographics there. And when I returned back to the US and I had the same view and same look in various leadership meetings, client meetings, et cetera, the visibility was very different, right? So it became sort of a personal passion, energy of mine to really dig down in terms of understanding what are some of the issues and sort of serve as my part of it in building for the next generation.
By the way, Harrison, I haven't mentioned you, but before I went into private equity and investment banking, I was in strategy consulting with a competitor of McKinsey at Bain & Company. And when I joined them, there were 23 people. When I left at 800. But the one thing that was the same is that I was the only Asian person when there were 23, and I was the only Asian person when there were 800. So that was, now it's changed obviously, but the world has changed, right?
Things have improved, I would say, Peter, but we're not all the way there, right?
Yeah.
What you had experienced is something we call the oni, right? You were the only individual, whether it's your ethnicity, your backgrounds, that's sort of in the room, and that sort of gives us the pause for concern. And I'll spend a little bit more time during my talk to talk more about it. And when you invited me to talk about this topic, I basically jumped at the chance, given the fact that, the McKinsey ethos is to have that intellectual curiosity and the fact that we aim to solve, the world's toughest problems. And at least in our mind, this is a problem, right? So what I'll do is as I go through the slides, I'll structure it into sort of three sort of things, right? The first is, really answering the question with some facts and figure in terms of how serious the problem is. Second is already teeing up some of the initial hypothesis on what could be some of the causes and drivers to this problem. And then thirdly is to have actually a constructive conversation and constructive view of what could be some of the possible solutions towards solving this problem. Now, that's not to say within this 1 hour, we'll solve everything, right? We will not. However, I think just at least starting the conversation will be a good step forward. So what you see here on the slide is that through these facts and figure, we know that the problem is real and it actually it is serious. On the left-hand side, you see that Asians are actually disproportionately represented at top colleges, right? Particularly the whites and the Asians, especially when you compare them to the Hispanics and the whites, right? And I think when you look at some of the top colleges out there, whether it's the Ivies, et cetera, the starting or incoming freshman class is actually very good way represented, right? Based on the various scores and SAT scores and entries and things like that, right? Now, I think this actually extends to some of the more, I would say, earlier career tracks at the various, industries as well as career paths that's out there, namely management consulting, financial services, law firms, et cetera, right? So one could actually argue at the earlier stage, right, of the career, as well as through the educational representation, Asian Americans are actually what I call, fair market share represented, if not more. However, this representation declines as you go through the leadership pipeline. Some of the data that you see here on the right-hand side is very similar to the ones that Buck presented. For example, we start off with the fact that the broader US population, according to the census, is about 6%. The professional workforce is 12 to 13%. However, as you sort of move up the ranks in terms of what we call the top executives, right? And this is a research that we had done for the top 1,200 executives at Fortune 100 companies, only about 7% are Asians. And this is actually inclusive of East as well as South Asians. Now, if you look even higher, beyond what I call top executives, which are typically EVPs, SVPs, directors, et cetera, into actual CEOs, we have 3, right? I think more recently, we just got one last week with Arvind Krishna, who was named the CEO of IBM. So we now have 4, right? Now, despite all the facts and figures that you see on this page and what Buck has shown you, what we also see is that Asians are actually the most likely group of any ethnic group to report that A, they're looking to be promoted to the next level. So they have the desire, they have the want, they want to do it. B, they have the career aspirations to become a top executives, right? Whether it's, VP, SVP, or even the CEO. And then C is they're also very optimistic that they will think that they will get there one day, right? Now the question is, why are we not getting there, right? If we have very good representation in the earlier stages of our careers in the educational system, however, the numbers are lacking and they have been consistently lacking, right? Not just in recent years, but has been trending through time. Why is that, right? So we'll get down into it a little bit more, but I think you also need to think about the broader macro aspect as well, especially, as companies look towards more digital technology, changing with the workforce, right? With millennials, et cetera, and some of the broader shifts in terms of macroeconomics, what will be the implication to this, right? And I'll just sort of leave that as a food for thought for now. Now, if you look at the next slide, we tee up some what I called hypothesis and some facts based on different facts and figures and research. The first, in terms of what could be a potential cause or driver of this particular problem, is what we call lack of self-advocacy. We see that Asians are typically less likely to self-promote and more likely to what we call, quote, unquote, trust the system, right? And this is based on some research that we had done, right? Where people respond and say, I think I'll be promoted when my superior or my manager thinks I'm ready, right? 30%, about a third of Asians think that way, whereas less than a fifth overall think that way. So it's really about how do you create sort of a model, a communication and conversation guide with others to ensure that you are indeed, sharing that you are ready for this. The second is, I actually reported, I don't want to be seen as too demanding when asking for a promotion. And about a fifth of Asians think that way and responded that way compared to less than a tenth, right?
But isn't it partly, Harrison, the kind of the early Asian mentality, which is if you study hard and get good grades, you'll succeed. And similarly, if you do really good work, and less of an emphasis on the networking and the mentoring, but also the other dimensions, to succeed in the West, right? Yeah. I think that's part of it as well, right?
I think that is at least one hypothesis we have, Peter, but at least on this slide, right, we're showing facts and figures, right? Because even if you look at Asians and Asian Americans, people come from very different walks of life, right? You have the ethnicity angle, right? East Asians, South Asians, Southeast Asians, etc. And then the other angle is there's all different paths towards it. We have colleagues who, for example, just recently finished their PhD, right? And is now at McKinsey. We have colleagues who are sort of born in the US, essentially second generation, where their parents migrated, right? And in some ways, they may not even view themselves as Asian, plus everything in between, right? So I think if you look at and sort of slice that in a granular way, that is definitely one hypothesis that we have, right? On the other side, we actually see that there's a lack of role models and formal mentorship and sponsorship for Asian Americans. Because again, in our research, Asians are significantly more likely to report a shortage of role models, executives, and board of directors at their companies. And this is from Asian societies. Conversely, fewer Asians also report to being a mentor of junior colleagues. So this in a way become, I would almost call it a negative reinforcement cycle, right? You don't see your role models ahead, so therefore you don't think you can get there. And therefore, fewer Asians are also being a mentor to the junior colleagues who are effectively the next generation and the next leaders for these organizations, right?
Which is kind of sad because it's saying we're not helping our own ethnic group, right?
Exactly, right? And another factoid, if you go back to the previous slide, Peter, is we see that and we know that people with mentor are 5 times more likely to get promoted, 5 times. So if you don't have it, you're effectively working in a very disadvantaged way. Secondly, people who have mentors actually have a higher retention rate. So to the earlier point about creating awareness in the organization, there is, in my mind, an actual business case around it, right? We know the high cost about onboarding, training, hiring, retaining. So it is in our mind that there is a business case around it that we should explore further.
We're going to have to hurry a little bit because we're running out of this portion of time, but okay.
So there's likely many other factors to it as well. We mentioned stereotyping, cultural, structural, etc. So why don't we move on to the next page, Peter? So what do we want to do to address it? Let's start teasing it out. First is really getting the data and getting the message out. Have the conversations internally in your community about these issues. It's really about having a dialogue. Some people, even within our organization, don't even know about it. So it's really about creating awareness today. So that becomes top of mind. Secondly, fix the broken rung, right? Form affinity groups and introduce programs to close a gap, particularly on mentorship and sponsorship. In our mind, this is a key enabler for that advancement topic. And this is both for East as well as South Asians, both within your company, for example, AAM, or any other employee resource group, cross-company, because as we mentioned, this topic and this issue is similar across all different type of companies, whether it's management consulting, financial services, etc., and even with other organizations out there, with Ascend, C100, Asia Society, etc. And the third is having a champion from the top, right? Really working with your fellow colleagues who are Asian or non-Asians to address this problem from the top of your organization, whether it's with the CEO directly or with the BU heads, and you sort of start expanding the tent, having these quote unquote friends and family to actually get that help. In our experience, at least using McKinsey as an example, or even as a microcosm, these levers actually really helped us land and expand our reach and relevance, as well as creating awareness for the people. Why don't we go on to the next slide? That being said, with all the different datas and challenges that we have shared, it is a great time to be an agent, right? And I've just highlighted some very successful cases here from Bowen Yang, who is the first individual profile cast on Saturday Night Live, Johnny Kim, right? Recently astronaut, Harvard medical student, graduate, Jeremy Lin, NBA champ, Sundar, who recently became not just the CEO of Google, but to all of Alphabet as well, and as well Aquafina, right? Of Crazy Rich Asian, The Farewell Frame, and who recently won a Golden Globe. This is just, starting the tip of an iceberg. And the whole idea here is how do we create more leaders in business, arts and entertainment, as well as politics for us to band together and move forward.
Okay. Well, as I predicted, the individual sections ran over, but let's go on to this next one, which is really, I have a couple of questions that I want to pose to our panelists before we open it up to Q&A. So, one of the issues here is that there are many, many factors that create this problem, right? It's a long, long list. If you think about them, the question is what do you think are the biggest obstacles? By the way, I will put a little plug in for our next webcast. Our second webcast will be on February 18th, and it's going to feature Ben Meng, who is the Chief Investment Officer of CalPERS, that, as you know, is the California Pension Retirement Fund with $400 billion of assets invested. And he's going to comment on his own personal experience, but some of the things that, in fact, have been mentioned by Harrison and by Buck that really helped him succeed, and some that are counterintuitive. So I will make sure that everyone who's on this call gets an invitation to that webcast. So the first question is, what do you think are the biggest obstacles of the obstacles facing Asian Americans with regard to success? Buck, do you have a comment?
Sure. Look, I want to take the question a slightly different way, in the sense that the biggest obstacle we have is that no one sees this as a problem. So there's no support, no dollars, no funding, no priority from corporations to address the problem. So whatever the issues are, because they're not looking at it, nothing's being done. And in particular, I want to bring up a story, or actually 2 stories, 3 stories. I've gone into 3 different very large tech companies in the Bay Area, and raised the question. And the feedback is from the diversity folks, we never looked at this problem because, every year we do the annual surveys, and everybody complains about problems except the Asian community here in my company. And you're the happiest people here. So we're fixing other people's problems we're complaining about. So until we let them know that we care about this, we're not going to get any help. And what the data tells me is that we've been talking about this for many years, and nothing's changing. And nothing's changing because we're not complaining about it.
Yeah.
So the biggest problem is we've got to get that word out.
Harrison, your answer?
No, and I fully agree with Buck, right? At the big picture macro level, if I was a CEO, there's many balls I'm trying to juggle, right? Running a business, pleasing my investor. Diversity and inclusion is typically there, but within diversity and inclusion is sort of where's Asian in the pecking order. And to Buck's point, not likely at the top for a variety of reasons, right? Now, to tactically answer your question, I personally do think the notion of stereotyping, culture, et cetera, do come into play, where, for at least many of us, right? Growing up, you're just taught to sort of work hard, things will sort of land, right? There is also potentially some stereotype on Asians not being good leaders, right? And there's some broader structural topics, right? Not having the formal mentorship and sponsorship programs in place, and then not having the institutional sort of infrastructure to set it up, right? The funding, the sponsors, et cetera.
Yeah. Next question is, any comments? I know both of you have looked at data across geography, by ethnic, different ethnic Asian American groups, gender, and so forth. Any comments on some significant differences that you see in terms of things being significantly worse or maybe better? By either geography, gender, or ethnic group within Asian Americans. Harrison, any comment?
No, I think broadly speaking, right, from a top-down level, it's roughly the same, right? At least in our experience, the funnel that you see on my previous material, it's a funnel that shrinks. It's not a straight line, right? The only question is how big does the funnel start with and how small does it go to, right? The shape of that funnel, right? And we see this time and time again in the tech companies. And Buck, you have a lot of data there. My experience, even from the management consulting world, is about 1/5 of our incoming business analysts as well as associate class are of Asian descent. And then less than 5% of them are at the senior partner as well as a partner rank, right? So that funnel is really much in place, right?
Buck, do you have any comment on that? Because I know you look at a lot of the data that other people produce.
The specific, I'll say this: the 2 things. The specific numbers is slightly better in one region versus another, for example, but still we're way represented. I mean, there's been no what I'd call no significant progress from region to region. The other thing looked at is I've actually looked at correlation, whether it makes more difference, whether there are more Asians in the population, percentage professionals, and there doesn't seem to be a correlation between big companies, small companies, lots of Asians, fewer Asians. So it's a general problem throughout, certainly in the industries I've looked at.
Yeah, that's right. Well, all I could say is part of the time I grew up in junior high and high school in Hawaii, and I will tell you it wasn't quite as much of a problem over there since there were so many Asians. But the key challenge was try to stay off your surfboard if you want to be successful, right? So if you look at the next one, though, is do you see any differences well, first of all, looking at some of the slides, like the one that Harrison had, it was a little depressing because it suggested that very little progress is being made over time. Is that really true, or it just happens to be the data you were showing? To what extent are we making progress? Or are we just basically flat in terms of making progress around this problem?
Me or Harrison?
Well, Buck, you can comment.
My data, I've looked at data looking for essential promotion rates from 2007 to 2018, and there've been no material change in performance. The gaps between Asians and non-Asians, Asian men and Asian women. So, but basically there has been very little very little gains.
I fully agree with Buck, right? I think there's probably a hair incremental difference, right?
Yeah.
But at least in a very minimal sense. And I think link back to sort of the McKinsey ethos, right? We don't want incremental change, we want step change, right? And the question is, how do we get there? And these are some of the conversations we're having today.
Yeah, and in particular, my observation there is when I looked at promotion into the middle management, very low and no change over time. What that to me that suggests is that because this was over from half a generation, that suggests that millennials had no effects. The next generation had no effects on changing the dynamics in pipeline. So no generational effects, and I also note I also suggest no effect because of changing immigration. That is more first generations in the population. That hasn't changed either.
I do think if you go back long enough in certain categories, there has been progress. I mean, an example is when I went to Yale undergraduate. When I got in, that out of 1,200 freshmen, there were exactly 15 Asian Americans total.
Well, no. There's a difference here. I think in the early stages where what is valued is technical knowledge or individual achievement, that is being fairly. But what you see is, and it's something Harrison alluded to, as you go up the pipeline, you have other things that are valued, and that's the things we're not that, and those are culture related. Those are things that they're really causing the cultural barriers.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we've got a lot. I have here, oh my gosh, we've got 23 questions, so we're obviously not going to answer them. But I'm just going to ask one other question, which is, the two of you obviously have your own data, but there are so many people who have done work in this area. Are there any, if you wanted to give some advice to the audience about where they could learn more about what the data shows about this issue, and the causes, what are some of the sources that maybe you can direct them to help them learn more about this? And I direct this to either one of you or both.
Yeah, I can start. Jennifer Lee is a professor at Columbia, and she wrote a book called the Asian American Achievement Paradox. And that talked about the younger stages. You can so you can look at that. My understanding is Margaret Chin is actually from at Hunter College. Is actually bringing a book out later this year, right on this point. I'd like to look at that, and also LEAP, the organization in Los Angeles, does an annual, I think, board survey about Asian Americans too.
So there's data out there,
well, right? I think the report you wrote on the Harvard Business Review, I think in 2018, as well as the publication you have with Accent.
Oh yeah, and I've published a number of papers with Denise Peck and Janet Wong about demographics in Silicon Valley.
And maybe a couple to add on my side, right? McKinsey has a woman in the workplace, proprietary research that has sort of different cuts of data that we have, along with we also recently published as a firm an op-ed on Fortune on this very topic. And then lastly, talking about books and authors is Jane Huynh, who wrote Breaking the Bamboo Ceiling, right, as well, right?
So we're up to 35 questions. So I'm going to start the Q&A earlier than we had scheduled, 10 minutes at the end. And what I'll do is I'll pick off some questions here. Okay. Well, there was one question, is there going to be a recording made available to this? And the answer is yes. That's the one I'm qualified to answer. So, okay. Question from Cindy Liu. She says, we know that soft skills are critical for advancement to the C-suite. Are there opportunities to work on these skills without sacrificing cultural diversity and roots? I guess, if you just mimic sort of the current thing, does that diminish your diversity and roots?
I argue that's a false choice. I argue that that if kind of bluntly, if you go back to China, people argue all the time. or present themselves all the time, or affirmative or assertive all the time. I don't believe that is countercultural to be assertive, to state your point, to have an opinion, and to argue your position when you believe you're right. I think everybody should do that, and that's what's valued, unfortunately, here.
I think on my side, right, in terms of what is needed to be success, right, there are things that people can train and do differently if they wish, but people also should have their own perspective of what is, I would call it, their tolerance level, right? If this is not something that they want to shift towards, I think it's perfectly fine, right? I think, we just need to create the awareness that the rules of the game, so to speak, is going to be different. And B, how you adjust yourself personally or not against those is sort of that awareness that we all each have to make individually.
Yeah, and I also argue that, certainly at Cisco and Silicon Valley, there's always a range of personalities, a range of styles. You don't have to be on the extreme range, and I think I was somewhere in the middle. So find, as Harrison, find a way to do it, but that's true to yourself. But it has to be done.
Look, there's different paths, right? Everyone has their own path, right, to their aspirations, I would say.
We have a question which is actually related to one of the comments Harrison made, which is, if agents don't seem to be helping each other, what are the top causes, and is it evolving for the better? And so, either one of you can answer that.
So I didn't quite catch the second part of the question. If agents are not agent
what
help,
are the top causes, and is this evolving for the better?
Yeah.
So
I think this is
I still don't understand the question.
Personal view, right? We know that right now, Asians are in generally not helping each other, right? And I think this is part of the stereotype cultural thing that we had talked about. Because one part of it is, growing up is a lot of it of, hey, just manage yourself, everyone will manage themselves, right? And I use the analogy of climbing up a mountain, right? Instead of helping each other climb up a mountain is, there's a mountain, you go to the top, I'll go to the top, I'll see you there, if I see you there, right? So I do think there is a little bit of a mind shift that is needed for Asians, number one. And I think the second one is, at least, where I am in my career, is really about enabling the next generation as well, right? How can I help create the next generation of Asian leaders, Asian executives, both in business as well as otherwise?
I'll make a two-part answer to that question. I totally agree with Harrison. I'll say Chinese or East Asian versus South Asian. Okay, Chinese and East Asians are much more focused on family and the tribe, and they're less concerned with the community. That is reflected in its civic responsibility of Asian, for example, we're the least engaged of any race. So we don't think of the broader community. We think of the people close to us and our family and our tribe. That to me, that's a big part of the difference between the South Asian and East Asian. Certainly in Silicon Valley, the South Asian community is much more coherent and think of themselves as community leaders. We don't see that self in our community.
The next question is one actually that Harrison and Buck, we chatted about when we were preparing for this. And an anonymous attendee says, Google, Microsoft, Adobe, to name a few, all have Asian CEOs, but they're all South Asian. However, East Asians are not represented anywhere. I think there are cultural differences between those two groups. What are your thoughts on the gap in East Asian leaders? And I know the data shows there's a gap because both of you have shared that with me. So either one of you can address this first or second.
Go ahead, Buck.
So I'll make 2 points. First of all, there are more of them. There are more South Asians and East Asians. I've looked at numbers where there are numbers, and they're still underrepresented. So don't assume that they're overrepresented. They have the same problems we do, East Asian versus South Asians. We have the numbers worse than them. I mean, that's the data that I've seen where I can get the data. All right. again, what explains some of that? I think a lot of it is because, my experience comes from Silicon Valley. There were South Asian leaders who were good role models, who mentored a lot of people, who cared about the community. We never saw that in the same extent for East Asians. So to the extent that community has done better than us, we should learn from them. And certainly one of my lessons from them is, we need community leadership, and that's what we're not getting.
I fully agree, right? The notion on mentorship and sponsorship is key, right? There is probably something, hypothesis that talks about culture and language as well. This, I don't think is proven,
Right.
but that is one hypothesis.
I agree.
But I also do want to clarify, beyond some of the CEOs that you mentioned that are South Asian, right? From Google, Microsoft, et cetera, there are also a few who are of East Asian descent in the Silicon Valley, right? From Broadcom, from NVIDIA, BlackBerry, et cetera.
And by the way, I want to one comment about, honestly, when I talk about role models, I think that also the fact that there were so many of them early on helped break the stereotype that East Asians still face much more than South Asians, because there's so many of them now. It's more expected of them than there is of East Asians.
Yeah. By the way, I'm going to make one comment, because 3 of the people asked this question about gender, and congender, and we did to talk about this, and the answer to that is, we are focusing on the issue of ethnicity, right? But there's no question that if you look at gender, if you're Asian, it doesn't help if in terms of ethnicity. Mm-hmm. If you're an Asian woman, it's even worse. Mm-hmm. So it's, but for different reasons, obviously, necessary. But, we're not going to dwell on that. But the answer is yes, that is, that is an issue, and that has to be dealt with in your own way. But I do think that it is worthwhile, as Buck said, to look at the differences in cultures by different Asian ethnicities, because they are quite different, right? The family, the culture, and so forth. And it does explain some, but not all of the reasons why there might be some differences. But across the board, all the Asian Americans suffer. So it's just a question of who's suffering more or less, right?
And to your point, I think this is then, in my mind, because we're all suffering, time for us to band together and help each other.
If you look at the data, if you look at the report that I published about Silicon Valley, and so it's only Silicon Valley, what you do find is that Asian women are the least promoted of all women or men. So absolutely, to your point, Peter, if we think we have problems as a racial community, Asian women have it worse.
There are 2 people who asked the same question, which is, do you think the Supreme Court rejection of affirmative action, the Harvard case and appeals, will be good for Asian Pacific American community, or will it make it worse?
With regard to this problem, it will not have an effect. If you look at Harvard, for example, 20% of the incoming freshmen are Harvard. That supports the fact that the Asian population is going into the white collar jobs, right? There's so many of us. Nationally 12%, certainly in Silicon Valley over 50%. The problem is next level, getting in from white collar jobs, getting a degree, getting a job, and then being promoted. So getting more Harvard grads will just mean more people not promoted.
I personally don't think it'll change too much, because as Buck mentioned, this is really early in the funnel, right? And this is actually only at one educational institution, right? I would imagine the individual who could or barely could get into Harvard would have plenty of other choices from an educational institution perspective. Also very fine as well, right? To me, part of that is the environment of the individual, the drive of the individual, as well as the environment for them.
Yeah. There's an interesting question here that someone has posed, which is, okay, people, there are things called EQ and IQ, right? Which is the emotional intelligence versus, just pure IQ. And the question is the relative emotional intelligence more important than the technical or IQ in order to succeed in the ranks in society? And obviously the implications are, are Asian Americans more highly trained in the technical side, right, than in the EQ side, and is that a factor? Any comments?
I would say both are important, first of all, right? But that being said, I do think, you cannot just have 100% and 0%, right? So I think the idea is, how do you have that balance? And I would actually say that as you move farther up, the EQ component becomes even more important.
Yeah, I agree. I think the issue becomes this: the higher and higher you get up, the less, I'll say it this way, the less you know, and the more and more you need to get things done through people, because that's all you're doing at that point. And so your people skills, I call it influencing skills. It's not communication skills. It's really influencing skills. The ability to either cajole, convince, be a leader somehow, and get people to do things for you.
By the way, this is not a question that people ask, but I have this question to ask the two panelists, and that is, if you study the wave of immigrants from different ethnicities, whether it were the Germans or the, or the Irish or the Jewish, European Jewish community and so forth, there are clearly patterns with regard to generational. In other words, how the first generation versus second generation versus third generation behaved, right? And so forth. So I guess, are there any comments you make that you would like to make if you think that there's some aspect of generational thing that may therefore change what the experience is over time?
Peter, I'm a pessimist with that, and I'll say this: a German, French, whatever it is, Italian can come here, and over the generation, they can lose their accent, they can lose their culture. We're identified by our face, and part of the problem is people's assumptions about who we are because of our face. I don't believe it's over discrimination, but there's implicit bias and stereotyping. So we'll never lose that, and so we'll change our culture, but how people see us, they don't know whether first generation, second generation, third generation. And I will get comments saying, you speak English very well, even though I was born here. So that's part of our problem.
Yeah. So Buck, you're never going to look German.
That's right.
Harrison, any comment?
No, I think nothing else to add from my side, right? And I think because of the many things Buck mentioned, it becomes increasingly for us to help each other, right? To at least band together, start together, and gather and galvanize the right collective group of colleagues, friends and family, etc., to sort of create awareness and create a dialogue on this topic and chart a way forward.
Yeah. A number of people ask questions which are not really part of this core topic of how bad is a problem, about what can we do? And I will just say that it's our plan for future webcasts and other events that we're putting together to focus on that issue as well, which is what is being done now and what can be done. So please stay tuned, because we will be setting up webcasts and panels and things to focus on that, because it is an important question, and we're going to be focusing on that as well. Let me see, a couple more questions. Okay. Well, a number of people just agreed with you, Buck, about, just being, visually.
Disagreed or agreed?
Agreed. So
okay,
they agreed. Well, they agreed that it's an issue, and I think they probably agree that you don't look German, right? So
I think the one thing I do want to say, though, I mean, certainly my perspective is always this: because of the way we are the way we look. Understand that rightly or wrongly, people make assumptions about you. So be clear that when you meet people and you communicate people, that somehow you break some of those assumptions early on, so they don't affect your interaction with them.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we have reached the end of our hour. I want to thank all the two panelists for really being very helpful in helping the audience understand how bad the problem is. In summary, it is a serious problem and seems not to be getting, better and at a good pace. But there were a lot of dimensions to the issue as they have revealed. I want to encourage all of you to to attend the February 18th webcast on personal experiences, and it's going to be a very interesting fireside chat with Ben Meng to talk about, and he's the first, not only Chinese American, but Asian American to run a very large pension fund, and I think he has some very interesting things to say. And we'll be letting all of you know about future events, because we hope that this is an ongoing program that helps really deal with the three things. One is helping people understand how bad the problem is. Two, understanding what things are available today that are working on the problem, but then galvanizing additional effort to solve the problem. I think my last comment is all of these are statistics about different people and so forth, but probably one of the most important things is to know yourself, understand what your strengths are, and know how you're different. And if you have a high EQ, then that's not an issue. If you have a low EQ and it's important to succeed, that's something to work on. Because you can look at broad statistics, but at the end of the day, all of you are individuals, and you need to forge a path that works and a formula that works for you. So with that, I want to thank everyone, and I look forward to seeing all of you one way or the other on a webcast or an event.